what these leaders are trying to prepare us for, both our President of the United States and the Surgeon General, is for a pretty big spike in the number of people who die from this. And they're saying it's this week, around midweek, where we could experience a day where there's as many people or more that die in one day than that died on the September 11th attacks.
I've talked to many of these governors, and here's what I would say to them right now. The next week is going to be our Pearl Harbor moment. It's going to be our 9/11 moment. It's going to be the hardest moment for many Americans in their entire lives. And we really need to understand that if we want to flatten that curve and get through to the other side, everyone needs to do their part.
What they focused in on, I think this is the key, was preparing the American people for what looks like it will be a big number of people that will, the fatalities from the virus. Now, as you said, Jordan, there is some good news that there were some numbers going down a little bit, but it's a little bit early to tell. But I think you have to look at the situation overall, and what we do as Americans is continue to practice social distancing. That is critical. Continue also to be aware of our surroundings if you see others that aren't. So we need to be in prayer. We need to be smart. We need to understand that the season we're living in, I think the fact the president laid out, and he did, that to expect this next week or two to be really rough for the American people, then the Surgeon General saying, this is our 9/11, this is our Pearl Harbor moment. Well, I think we need to be prepared for it.
I think what they're trying to tell us is that generations from now, we will still be talking about this, much like we still talk about Pearl Harbor, almost as if it happened recently, and certainly 9/11 as well. For the country, for Americans as a culture, who normally most Americans don't serve in the military, they don't go to war, and yet we had tremendous ramifications after Pearl Harbor and after 9/11 that it affected the entire country. So I think the Surgeon General is correct. He is spot on. This will be one of those stark moments, much like 9/11 and much like Pearl Harbor. And I will say this, Jordan, an enemy that you cannot see, such as this virus, is a lot more difficult to fight than an actual enemy that you can see on a battlefield. And this is where the Surgeon General, I think his analogies are spot on. The casualty rate has the potential to exceed anything we've ever faced as a nation, other than maybe the casualties from the American Civil War or World War II.
Really, the frontline troops, if you will, are the first responders, the physicians, the nurses, the technologists, the folks that work in the hospital. They're on the front lines. And the president said it, and you've seen some of these pictures, like in New York City, where the fire department and the police departments will come out in front of the hospitals and applaud the doctors, nurses, techs, the folks that keep the hospital clean as they're walking into, as the president calls it, they are literally going to battle. So I think what Wes said is absolutely correct. It doesn't minimize anything about anybody else, but it is serious.
There's kind of conflicting news today because there's good reports, at least potentially good news, that in some of the highest peaking areas that we may be reaching that peak level, and the curve could start to trend downward. Now, we also know that when the curve trends down, it trends from a high point and it trends down slowly. So when you do that and you start sliding down, you're still experiencing a number of new cases and a lot of fatalities that go with that, because you don't just peak and it stops. You peak and you have to go back down the hill. And then in other areas of the country, this is probably more like later in the week. So again, and then some are even preparing for into May.
It's not a inverted V peak. It's not like it hits and then just crashes.
Right.
So it peaks, and then we try to level it out. Now, during that leveling out process, as Jordan said, if you had 3,000 fatalities on a day that it peaks, and then the next day it's 2,700. That's still a lot of people.
A lot of people, yep.
So, we just got to brace ourselves for this.
People look out their own door, they see their own local news. It may not add up to what the national news is talking about, and I get that. So I think it's important to put this into scope. When they talk about a Pearl Harbor kind of moment, they mean nationwide we experience as a country, and it doesn't mean that necessarily you're going to experience where you live what New York City is experiencing. But you want to make sure that you don't have outbreaks, and on a smaller scale, maybe by number, but outbreaks that in your community would be just as significant